know the old highlights feature Goofus and Gallant? Sure, everybody does. Highlights magazine started featuring it in 1946, making it a part of every baby boomer's childhood and every generation afterwards, teaching us what is good and bad behavior. Goofus, of course, always portrayed selfish, boorish behavior. I blame his parents, because what else do you expect after giving a baby boy the name Goofus? He literally had no chance. Living down to the name was just a survival mechanism. For every action, there is an equal and opposite reaction, and as selfish and boorish as Goofus was, Gallant was the equal and opposite: kind, thoughtful, courteous, polite to a fault. Some people thought they were brothers, twins even, but no way were these two kids raised by the same parents. Although it does seem somewhat cruel to name some kid Gallant. Can you imagine the pressure to live up to that name? It'd be like naming your kid Genius or Prodigy. Geez, a kid like that can't come home from school with a normal hand turkey. No, 3-year-old Prodigy would have to come home with something like this. Or if he was a literalist, this. They could never bring home a B on a test. Even an A- falls short of genius or prodigy level. It says it right there, A-. So here's a couple of examples. There's Goofus ignoring the trash on his way out, and Gallant deciding to rake the leaves before going swimming, which just begs the question of why he's either raking leaves in the summer or the pool is still open and he's shirtless in October. Not to mention the fact that the leaves are obviously still on the tree in the background, and there's not a leaf on the ground. Yeah, I don't think Gallant gets any credit for this one. That's like me saying, honey, I'm going out with the guys, but don't worry, I'll clean the elephant pen first. Here's another one of Goofus taking the last apple, while Gallant shares his orange with his friends. Seems to me that's comparing apples to oranges. There's no doubt that Goofus is a brat who probably grew up into a jerk, the kind of guy no one wants to be around. But let's be real. Does anyone really want to hang around with Gallant Two Shoes? I mean, come on. I appreciate courteous, respectful kids as much as the next guy, but this kid isn't even a boy version of Mary Poppins, who's only practically perfect in every way. He is perfect in every way. Can you see Gallant as a terrible two? No way. His twos were terrific. Never threw a tantrum, never got moody, never had to take a time out. I mean, hanging around with him would just be impossible. He'd always look like a dim bulb compared with his bright light. And you'd pray your parents never met him, because then it would always be like, why can't you be more like Gallant? And you'd be like, well, at least I'm not Goofus. And they'd be like, we're not talking about Goofus, we're talking about you. It's like when Pam makes me watch some romantic comedy with her, and right at some sappy moment, she turns to me and says, why can't you be all romantic and sensitive like him? And I'm like, it's because he's a fictional character. He literally does not exist. I bring all this up because I was recently asked by a couple people, as a matter of fact, why we don't know anything about Jesus' childhood. We know he's taken to Egypt as a baby, and we see him again in the temple at age 12, but that's it. Why doesn't the Bible reference Jesus' childhood? I'll go even further than that. The Bible doesn't reference Jesus' life, except for that temple incident, until he's through his young adult years. He's 29 or so when he shows up to be John the Baptist. But let's stick with his childhood. What was Jesus like as a child? Did he go through the terrible twos? Did he ever have to take a time out? Did he eat all his vegetables all the time? Did he ever have to be told to clean his plate? Here's what I've noticed whenever I've mentioned Jesus' childhood and suggested that maybe he was a normal 2-year-old with normal 2-year-old behavior. People naturally kind of recoil from that. The only thumbs down I've ever received from these YouTube videos was a few weeks ago when I talked about Mary and Joseph having to travel around with the toddler and then showed a picture of a toddler having a meltdown. Now, I don't know if that's why the person gave me a thumbs down. Maybe they just didn't like the sermon as a whole. But judging by how people seem to imagine Jesus, I'm kind of betting that it is. Because people tend to think that Jesus was an ancient Israelite version of Gallant, an ideal boy, an ideal man. Or rather, I would say an idealized boy and an idealized man. What we think he should have been, since he was the Son of God, part of the Holy Trinity, God of very God, the great I Am. Which, if you think about it, is not a very human. I mean, we know doctrinally that Jesus is 100% God and 100% human, but we can do math, and that math just doesn't add up. So while we acknowledge the doctrine of the full divinity and full humanity of Jesus, in reality, we see him more like fully divine human, God in a bod. He's human in that he's got flesh and feels pain, but not human like a normal human. He wasn't a normal baby and not a normal toddler and not a normal teenager. He was not normal, not less than human. No, certainly not that. He's not Goofus, but he's not a normal human either, which only leaves more than human, right? Superhuman, Gallant. You actually see this idealizing of Jesus early on in Christian literature. Take that temple incident, which we read about in Luke chapter 2, verses 41 through 52. We read, "The child grew and became strong, filled with wisdom, and the favor of God was upon him. Now, every year his parents went to Jerusalem for the festival of the Passover. And when he was 12 years old, they went up as usual for the festival. When the festival was ended and they started to return, the boy Jesus stayed behind in Jerusalem, but his parents did not know it. Assuming that he was in the group of travelers, they went a day's journey. And then they started to look for him among their relatives and friends. When they did not find him, they returned to Jerusalem to search for him. After 3 days, they found him in the temple, sitting among the teachers, listening to them and asking them questions. And all who heard him were amazed at his understanding and his answers. When his parents saw him, they were astonished. And his mother said to him, 'Child, why have you treated us like this? Look, your father and I have been searching for you in great anxiety.' He said to them, 'Why were you searching for me? Did you not know that I must be in my father's house?' But they did not understand what he said to them. Then he went down with them and came to Nazareth and was obedient to them. His mother treasured all these things in her heart. And Jesus increased in wisdom and in years and in divine and human favor." Okay, so honest question. Is Jesus at all a little bit like Goofus in this story? Or is he more like Gallant? Does he bear any responsibility for the situation? I guarantee you will search far and wide for any biblical interpreter who will suggest that anyone is at fault except Mary and Joseph, who just assumed that he was with the group, and you know what happens when you assume. So then they go back to Jerusalem and search for him for 3 days, for 3 whole days before they ever think about looking in the temple. And Jesus is like, well, duh, where else did you think I'd be? What took you guys so long? Except Jesus would never cop an attitude with his parents, so forget the duh part. He's more like puzzled, maybe even a little hurt that they wouldn't think to look first in the temple. Like, I feel like you don't even know me at all. But I mean, it's not like Jesus is a 2-year-old who just wandered off while his parents weren't looking. He's 12. In other words, he's almost an adult. And yes, for most of human history, there were really just 2 stages in a person's life. There was childhood, and then there was adulthood. Adolescence is a modern phenomenon. Just look it up. So Jesus is a few months from his bar mitzvah, his entry into adulthood. If anything, this is a coming of age story. Jesus separating himself from his parents' responsibility and authority, ready to forge out on his own. I mean, most teenagers think that they're ready before they really are. But this story says that Jesus was ready, but his parents weren't. So he stayed under their authority. As verse 51 says, he went down with them and came to Nazareth and was obedient to them. See? Not normal. He's human, but he's more than human. He's superhuman. And then that's it. That's all the Bible has to say about Jesus' childhood. And that's simply to say that he was a man before the rest of the boys were. He's not like us. Now, when that question about Jesus' childhood is posed to me, it's tempting for me to say that if knowing about Jesus' childhood was really important, we know about it. One or more of the gospel writers would have included it, and since they didn't, we can conclude that it's not really that important to know. And there's some truth to that. But still, we'd kind of like to know some more, right? Turns out we're not the only ones. Throughout the centuries, people wrote stories about Jesus as a child, and these were popular enough to have been written and copied and preserved. Otherwise, we wouldn't have known about them, right? There's a writing named Pseudo-Matthew, written in the 6th or 7th century, and then there's one called the Arabic infancy gospel, probably also around the 6th century, and one called the Irish versified narrative, written maybe as early as 700 A.D. But the earliest collections of stories about Jesus as a child date back to the 2nd century, so not long after the New Testament was written, showing us that curiosity about Jesus' childhood dates back almost to the beginning. There's what's called the Gospel of James, and there's also a short work called the Infancy Gospel of Thomas. This short work shares a common feature with all the other works about Jesus' childhood. They all present Jesus as not a normal human being, as a child with superhuman powers. So let me just summarize some of the story, the account of the infancy gospel of Thomas. So it starts out, Jesus is about 5 years old, and he's playing by a stream. He collects some of the water, dams it off, and immediately the water becomes clear and pure and clean. And then he uses the water to make clay out of dirt and forms 12 sparrows out of the clay. The only problem is he did this on the Sabbath. So this old Jewish man sees him and reports it to Joseph, and Joseph rushes to the stream, distraught that Jesus would dishonor him. At which point Jesus claps his hands together, and the sparrows come alive and fly away. And there's a boy standing there, and he comes and he kind of kicks the clay and lets all the water Jesus had collected out. So guess what Jesus does? He curses the boy, and the boy dries up like a dead tree. Except he's not a dead tree, he's a dead boy. And the boy's parents complain to Joseph because, well, And next, Jesus is walking through the village, and another boy comes up and hits him on the shoulder. So Jesus curses him, and he dies. And that boy's parents complain to Joseph because, So Joseph sits Jesus down for a little talk, but Jesus knows that Joseph is just repeating what the parents of the dead boys are saying, so he curses them too, and they become blind. So Joseph grabs Jesus by the ear and he pulls hard because, that's what you do to a kid who's killed two bullies and blinded the parents of the boys for being, upset and all. And then Josephus hires a teacher named Zacchaeus to come and to teach Jesus his ABCs, or his alpha, beta, gammas, as it were. And Jesus says to the teacher, he says, "You want to talk to me about alpha? Do you know the nature of alpha?" And the old guy is like, "What nature? It's just a letter. There's no hidden meaning, no backstory, no secret metaphorical meaning." And Jesus is like, "Well, how are you going to teach me the beta if you don't even know the nature of the alpha?" Sheesh. So Zacchaeus goes to Joseph and says, look, this kid knows more about the alpha, beta, gammas than I do. I have nothing to teach him. He's a freaking genius. But other people tell Zacchaeus that, they need to teach Jesus who the boss is. So Jesus gets wind of this and he kills them. and that pretty much ends all the killing, because people learn not to make Jesus angry. So then he starts moving on to nicer miracles. A kid dies and Jesus brings him back to life, and another kid half chops off his foot with an axe, so Jesus puts his foot back on and heals it. And one day he's working with Joseph, and Joseph apparently forgot to measure twice before cutting once, and he cuts a piece too short. So Jesus just stretches the wood to the correct size. And on and on and on it goes with Jesus healing people and bringing people back to life and carrying water in his cloak without none of the water leaking out. And then it all ends with the story of Jesus in the temple at 12, pretty much repeating Luke's narrative. Now, I'm not claiming that any of that stuff actually happened, but it does give us some insight into what some people very early on wanted Jesus to be like. They wanted him to be Superboy. They wanted him to be gallant, but with enough goofus in him to command respect and not be pushed around. And while we may not like the fact that he kills these kids, we do like the fact that he stands up to the bullies. He's Ralphie taking on Scut Farkas. He's Danielson wiping on and wiping off against the jerks from Cobra Kai. And he's George McFly taking down Biff. I mean, if Goofus insists on picking on Gallant, you gotta figure even Gallant's got his breaking point, right? You can't be a man, a real man, much less a Superman or a Superboy or whatever, and let yourself get pushed around. Just let people falsely accuse you and falsely arrest you and falsely put you on trial and falsely condemn you and falsely beat you and falsely crucify you. I mean, you only do that if you're defenseless, and Jesus wasn't defenseless. See, the interesting thing about these stories is that they create the Jesus we want, not the Jesus we got. We don't really want the Jesus we got. We want the Jesus who will stand up to the bullies, kill them if necessary, but at least rough them up enough to know that you don't make him mad or there will be consequences. Because everybody knows that if you stand up to the bullies and punch them right in the mouth, they don't carry resentment in their hearts. They don't plot their own revenge, get reinforcements, or at least bring a gun to a knife fight. No, that's not what they do. Punch a bully in the mouth and they wash and wax your car for the rest of your life. Yeah, that's what happens. Everybody knows that. But that's the Jesus we would follow. That's the Jesus we want to be friends with. We don't want to be friends with a jerk like Goofus, but we also don't really want to be friends with Gallant either. Not close friends. And not just because he sets a bar that's just too hard to reach, but mainly because Gallant's going to get beat up a lot. I mean, a kid like that's going to have a target on his back all the time. We want a moral Jesus, but also one that's willing, when pushed too far, to kick a little butt and take names. That's the Jesus we would want to be like. And if we can't be like him, we want to stay close to him. But that other Jesus, the one we got, the one presented in the Gospels, I mean, we understand why he couldn't call an army in and save himself. We understand why he told Peter to put his sword away and allowed himself to be arrested and beaten and executed. We may even see the wisdom in it. But we think, well, he's a better man than I am. I mean, I could maybe do it if I had no choice, but if I had a choice, no way I could have that much power at my disposal and not use it against the bullies of the world, the pure evil people that just inflict so much harm against so many innocent people. No way. I mean, maybe Jesus could, although we're not sure that he should have. But he's a better man than I am. He's a much better man than I am, which is how we think of Jesus. He's a much better person than we could ever be, which, when you think about it, kind of lets you off the hook to even try. I mean, Jesus wasn't a normal baby, and he wasn't a normal toddler, and he wasn't a normal 12-year-old, and he wasn't a normal man. I mean, Jesus was more than human. He was God human, which is something that I can never be, and I shouldn't even try. And so I don't. And why should I? Jesus already did it for me. The writer of Hebrews says that Jesus was tempted in every way that we are, and yet without sin. And we say, yep, see, Jesus ain't normal, because no matter how much I try, I sin. Only Jesus could live a sinless life. And the fact that he did proves that he's different, that he's better than I am, and trying to be like him is not just ridiculous, it's futile. It's worse than Gallant. Gallant, I could see myself being like, maybe, but Jesus? No way. But the point of Hebrews 2:15 isn't how different Jesus is from us, but how similar. The writer of Hebrews is writing to Christians who are being unfairly persecuted for their faith, and they want to fight back, but their commitment to the way of Jesus means that they can't fight back. But it's hard, and they aren't sure they can do it. They're being sorely tempted to either fight back with fists and swords, or to give in and renounce Christ altogether. But they just don't think they can do what Jesus did. And the writer of Hebrews is saying, yes, you can. Hold fast to your confession. Jesus did it, and so can you. But you have something even he didn't. You have him as the great high priest who stands in the presence of God and advocates for you, who prays for you, and who has sent his Spirit to abide in you and around you and within the body of fellow confessors. So, we don't know what Jesus was like as a child growing up. We know little about his childhood, and it really is true that if it was really important, we would probably know something. I'm pretty confident that he was at the head of his class in synagogue school, and he saw things that other kids didn't, maybe even things that his own teachers missed. But he was more like us than we think. And maybe if we could finally see ourselves the way that God sees us, as his precious sons and daughters, we could stop focusing on the ways he's more different than us, and we could start to see more of the family resemblance. Father, Jesus is such an interesting, such a compelling person that we wish we knew more about him. We wish we had more stories about him from his adulthood and his childhood, and we wish we just knew more. But we know enough. What we know is sufficient. We know that though he was fully God, he emptied himself of that power, and he came to earth to be one of us, and to show us what it's like not to be a God human, but to show us what it's like to be fully human, exactly as you created us to be, and as we can be once again. Help us to keep our eyes on Jesus, the author and perfecter of our faith, and to know that the way that he lived is available to each of us, if only we have the courage to follow. We thank you that we have Jesus as our great high priest, our great mediators, to stand at your right hand and to advocate for us. And we know, Father, that when he speaks to you about us, he speaks to our loving Heavenly Father, who already loves us as much as he already can, and believes in us more than we even believe in ourselves. Help us, O Lord, to see ourselves as you see us, to see each other as you see us, and to keep pressing on toward that goal of the prize, the high prize in Christ Jesus. For it's in his name that we pray. Amen.